1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Spock Talk, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and childcare become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died?
Last episode, we discussed Dr. Benjamin Spock's political activism, and in this episode, we are talking about his role as a famous public figure. In the grand American tradition of celebrity making, it's a feedback cycle. Spock was one of those people who had something special. He had a unique perspective on parenting. He was a tremendously gifted communicator. The public gave him a lot of feedback, most of it positive. And then let's be crass, he made a bunch of money, and being Spock, the public persona, became his livelihood.
I actually kind of love that he became famous for doing something very concrete, writing this book. And then he went on to become famous for being a guy who knows stuff. It feels really refreshing because now I feel like we just skip that first step and people don't do the concrete thing first.
Yeah, totally. In the 1950s, just after he published the book, at the pinnacle of Dr. Spock's fame, he reached the highest form of celebrity bestowed in American culture, a household name. His biographer, Thomas Maier, compared Spock to Kleenex, Frigidaire, and Campbell's soup. We, in 2023, would call it a brand, and the Spock brand was synonymous with raising children during an era more devoted to the practice than any other time. Parents even referred to their children as Spock babies. In that post-World War II era, the U.S. was a superpower, and it was a great time for national confidence and economic stability. It was a wonderful time in history to be a white, middle-class American. From our historical perspective, when I look at cultural products from that time, the word that comes to mind is smug.
I mean, with good reason, Deborah. We had it all figured out. We had single-handedly won World War II and proved capitalism's superiority as an economic system and overall worldview, right? Elvis definitely invented rock and roll, and Ray Kroc introduced America to the world's best French fries. Hitchcock made his best movies in the United States, and Lucy and Desi proved that racism wasn't a thing. I mean, the world should have looked up to us.
You have a lot of good points, Katie. Spock admitted that he had a needy ego and he really cared what people thought, especially when it came to the public perception of his nuclear family. Spock wrote that he had a lot of anxiety about his son's behavior, and he thought that people would enjoy knowing if a famous child specialist didn't have perfect children or wasn't a perfect parent.
Whereas today, being the child of a psychiatrist is the butt of jokes. Of course, they're going to be the screwed up ones. But it does really make sense. When something is your job, you want the world to see you as good at that thing in your personal life as well. I mean, I'm the world's least organized librarian, and it is a continual source of shame. I also think we just all know this pressure today in small ways, if only to present the perfect image of our families on social media, right?
Everybody wants to have like a positive public persona.
And to be seen as having their stuff together, no matter what that stuff is.
Totally. Unfortunately for the Spocks, Jane was kind of a tricky problem. When they lived in Pittsburgh, when Jane was hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia, Spock kept a very distinct wall between his private problems and the affable, almost trouble-free persona he assumed for the public. Let's sidetrack and talk briefly about religion here. It seems pretty strange from our 2023 perspective to have a hugely public person not have any ties to religion at all. Or is that weird?
Okay, so not to take a couple steps back into what we discussed a couple episodes ago having to do with communism and capitalism and the Cold War. Do you think that the lack of emphasis on religion at that time was maybe intentional in American society, just to like tout the fact that we are the land of freedom and free choices?
I definitely think it's a historical difference. Religion didn't play as much of a performative role in public life as it did starting in like the 1980s and 1990s with conservative Christianity. And it was also a cultural difference because Spock was part of the New England elite.
I just think there's no way today Spock would get to the point in his career that he did, even early on, without being asked explicitly about religious issues.
Okay, so it is weird
Very
to
much
us.
so. Yeah.
Not weird back then.
Yeah.
At one point, his son, John, as a young adult, expressed resentment that his parents never taught him about religion. Even though he wasn't a church-going religious person, Spock was very concerned with morality, and late in life, he became interested in spirituality through his second wife, Mary Morgan. But for him, this wasn't about mysticism. It was more about how to be a good person. Basically, when he talked about this, he mentioned aspects of life like generosity, helpfulness, idealism, how you help other people with your job, how you help the world. He seemed really sincere about it.
I think that's really a shame that if later in life he became interested in spirituality and he didn't inject like a whole chapter on crystals into the book.
Okay, back to fame. Even toward the end of his life, Spock remained on the inside an insecure and needy person. Thomas Maier wrote, despite his public image of Dr. Spock as a friendly, gregarious sort, even at his advanced age, Ben remained full of nagging doubts and introspection. Though he had gained wide fame and influence, Ben still viewed himself as under-assertive with no best friends, not much different from the shy young man who hoped to prove himself at Yale.
Isn't the fact that he didn't have friends kind of like universal problem for American men? Like, hasn't there been recent research about the fact that men are on the whole way more susceptible to the problems that come with loneliness because they don't prioritize relationships because those relationships are viewed as inherently feminine and thus undesirable?
Yeah, and when I think about what I've read about Spock, it seems like he did have a whole bunch of people that he like collaborated with and confided in, but maybe he thought of those more as professional relationships instead of personal friendships. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you never like drop the act, even though you're surrounded by a lot of people. That's kind of sad.
We talked in our Spock's Women's Group episode about how Spock and Jane would go out dancing, sometimes several nights a week in the earlier years of their marriage when they lived in New York City. Jane would get tired and want to go home, but Ben would keep dancing with other women. For Spock, the appeal, though, wasn't the other women necessarily. He craved the spotlight. Thomas Maier wrote that no one enjoyed these nights out more than Ben. Unlike other men, he liked to kick up his heels, throwing off the white physician's coat and pinstriped suits to wear his elegantly designed tails and high-collar dress shirt. Ben fancied himself a dandy, the most popular dancer on the floor.
This segment from the book is so evocative. I just need you to close your eyes for a minute and picture this, okay?
Okay.
So we're going to have an elaborate dance sequence. You have Spock, who takes center stage in front of the bandstand. His toe starts tapping, and he slowly sheds his white lab coat to reveal a dapper suit. And then Gene Kelly style, he actually kicks up his heels, and the music gets faster and faster as he leaps across the floor, tails flying behind him. I love it. I think it's just a really well-written phrase right there.
Oh my gosh. I've been fantasizing about writing a Spock biopic or biopic. I never know what to say it. But what about Spock the musical?
I love it. I mean, you already knew I was going to say I love it.
In Rochester, Minnesota, when Spock was working at the Mayo Clinic, he and Jane would socialize with the younger faculty members and wives instead of the faculty of their generation. At these dances, dressed in his favorite tails and high collar, Ben displayed his physical grace. Still broad-shouldered and athletically thin, he smiled radiantly with more self-assurance than he ever had shown as a young man and exuded a healthy, mature virility. Jane was the perfect partner, light on her feet and able to look adoringly at her husband as they waltzed across the floor. Those who remember the Spocks from these dances in Rochester always bring up their beautifully coordinated dancing. Spock was just a natural performer. It sounds like he really enjoyed the performance, being admired, having people look at him and look at him with his wife.
This seems like the dream of every nerdy, shy young person, is that once they get older, all the young people will finally think they're cool.
Totally. Judy, this is kind of sad, the family gossip daughter-in-law, she recalled how when she complimented her mother-in-law, Jane, about their dancing, Jane told Judy that Spock only treated her with affection and respect in front of other people.
Once again, poor Jane. She clearly didn't get the same validation from this public adoration that her husband did, but he didn't care.
No, we keep talking about how he wasn't a great first husband. And although he was a wonderful parent educator, I don't think he was the best parent. It sounds like he was standoffish, not very affectionate, overly critical, in part because he had this public persona and credibility to uphold. I read about how Spock and Jane got along with their kids as adults. In 1970, Judy and Michael lived in Lincoln, Massachusetts with their 3 kids. Spock and Jane would stay with them during that trial when Spock was indicted as part of the Boston Five. And Judy told Maier that Ben and Jane regaled them with charming tales about themselves, but they rarely inquired about the lives of Mike and Judy and their kids. Judy would say that they would tell you endless anecdotes about their own experience, pretty much designed to amuse or impress, but nothing very intimate, and they never asked about Judy and Michael's lives. They appeared to have no interest in anything but themselves.
Ugh, I mean, this sounds awful, but I guess when so much of your life is chat shows and glad-handing, telling charming anecdotes to please the crowd, it must be hard to turn that off.
Mm-hmm. Now, have you ever been in a social situation with like multiple sets of parents and one of the dads is a stay-at-home dad?
No, I've actually never been part of a social circle that included any stay-at-home dads. The closest I've come is having the occasional stay-at-home dad in my music classes.
Okay. Well, I've been in this type of social situation before, and even when there are multiple moms whose main role is caretaker, like they don't work outside the home or they do very part-time work, I have observed that stay-at-home dads get an immense amount of credit and admiration and compliments, and people will say things like, "Oh, he's a stay-at-home dad," in a really gushy way, and women who are more often in this role, it's normalized for them, are often referred to as, "She's just a stay-at-home mom." And in a party-type situation, absolutely the fact that any woman is a stay-at-home mom is never worth anyone's time to comment on. So where I'm going with this is that Spock, just by virtue of being a male in this baby and child space of the public sphere, he gets the extra benefit of being male because it's just ever so slightly unexpected that a man would be so good with kids. And he really is. And just looking at the pictures, reading about the anecdotes, he's genuinely great with children and babies. He cares for them. He enjoys spending time with them. He has a lot of empathy and good ideas. I can't tell you about the number of pictures where kind of an older Spock is just like cuddling an infant or toddler looking adorable.
Yes, I've seen those pictures, and it's true. They are adorable. I mean, I guess I kind of got to give him credit for not just resting on his rep and actually putting in the work to be good with kids. Because you're right, the bar was so impossibly low for men to get credit as good dads or for being good with kids. It still is that low. My husband took the kids alone to a birthday party last week, and I think he's still glowing from all the praise he received.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, here's another anecdote. I found an absolutely delightful article from the Saturday Evening Post, published in 1966 when Spock was teaching at Western Reserve. He took ice dancing lessons 3 times a week on his lunch hour at the Cleveland Skating Club.
Wow, you talk about wanting to write the Spock musical, and it's just writing itself, Deborah. This is amazing.
I know. So dancing and ice dancing are just a couple of ways that Spock got the attention that he needed. And seeking the limelight was consistent throughout his medical career and in his political activism. Let's listen to audio from a 1970 interview with Dr. Benjamin Spock by WOI TV reporter Dorcas Spear, which is in the public domain, courtesy of the Iowa State University Archives.
How do you manage to meet such a rigid schedule and with enthusiasm? You don't look tired or any of these things.
I'm terribly proud about this, actually. Sometimes the executive director of the Civil Liberties Legal Defense Fund, for whom I travel and speak and raise money, sometimes comes with me, and he's only 25 years of age, and he keeps collapsing with exhaustion, wanting to go home to bed, and I keep going on. And you know, especially as you get older and older, you're prouder and prouder to be thought of as spry. Well, actually, to be serious about it, one is that I'm mostly speaking about the ending the war in Vietnam and the right to dissent, which is an absolutely crucial subject that inspires me to go on and on. Then the other part, and I think this is even more important, is that young people think of me as their friend and they greet me enthusiastically. And in the auditorium at Iowa State, this huge, beautiful auditorium was absolutely jammed right up to the rafters with students, and they gave me a standing ovation. I used to be just an ordinary professor in a medical school at Western Reserve Medical School until I was forced by age to retire 2 years ago. I wasn't particularly popular there, just an average professor. The kids find out what you've got to say, your limitations and your old stuff. Now I go from university to university, only staying for one day. They assume that I'm on their side, their friend, because I was indicted and convicted for a while for resistance to the war. And so I get these glowing, enthusiastic, noisy responses, and this is marvelous. How many old people in retirement can get a standing ovation every night? So this buoys me on, and then after I've done it for a month, then I suddenly realize I am a little wilted, and then I go off and sail a boat in the Virgin Islands for a month.
Thanks to the Iowa State University Archives for preserving and making available that WOI TV interview.
He's just so self-aware in some ways, and so clueless in others. Like, haha, of course people love me. They only see me for a couple hours.
Yeah, this is pretty classic extrovert behavior, I think, feeling really energized from the experience of being in front of an adoring audience. Let's talk about how Spock was a great public communicator and user of mass media. Do you have any opinions about the journalist and best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell?
I have never read any of his books, but I'm aware that he has a reputation for playing kind of fast and loose with research, drawing sweeping conclusions without the necessary facts to back them up. But I am still a fan of his revisionist history podcast. His series on The Little Mermaid in particular was great and definitely worth a listen.
I have also never read his books, and I don't have much of an opinion of him. But I did listen to an interview with him about Dr. Spock, and Gladwell talked about how there were 3 really famous doctors in the mid-20th century. Dr. Jonas Salk, the polio vaccine guy, Dr. John Rock, who invented birth control, and Dr. Spock. And the celebrity doctor phenomenon, according to Gladwell, was a product of middle-brow media culture, popular magazines like Life and Time. Spock participated in this feedback loop of fame by writing popular columns for Redbook and Ladies' Home Journal. And also there's his voice. At this point, I've listened to lots of old Spock archival audio, and he had that charming New England old money Brahmin accent. He was an extremely willing participant in the entertainment industry. His IMDb page lists a number of cameos. He was on a TV series called Valentine's Day in 1965, Good Company in 1967. He was on the Art Linkletter Show in 1970, and he was on a talk show called Not for Women Only, hosted by Barbara Walters in 1975.
Okay, I would definitely watch a show called Not for Women Only, and I feel like this should also be the title of a category in Netflix. Like, gentlemen, you don't have to take your wife's word for it. You will like this, even though the thumbnail image includes people kissing.
That would be a good category.
Yeah.
I think this is a big part of his appeal. He gave the impression of being very candid and very revealing about himself. And the impression of vulnerability is quite endearing. We know that there were aspects of his personal life that he was not candid about and that he actively worked to hide, like Jane's alcoholism and mental health issues. So he wasn't entirely an open book, but he presented himself as if he were an open book. And I think this makes him very, very appealing. And at that point in history, mid and late 20th century, there really truly was mass media. There were very few television channels and a few national magazines. Things weren't so segmented and chopped up into niche streaming platforms and websites and social media feeds. There simply weren't as many choices.
Think about one of the few experiences shared by almost every adult these days, standing at the grocery checkout counter. I mean, even this is less true with Instacart and blah, 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 self-checkout, but okay, we can all relate to this situation. Just picture the magazine rack.
Mm-hmm.
On a good day, I know about half the people on the covers, and they're all, quote unquote, important enough to merit a spot on a print magazine cover. That would never have happened in Spock's day. Like, you would have known all these people.
Right. Another part of Spock's appeal, I think, was his ability to change. One major example of this mutability is how he parented his two sons very differently, as they were born 10 years apart. John Spock was born in 1933. He was raised in that Holt way, very strict behaviorist. And Michael Spock, the younger son, was born in 1944 when the Spocks were deep into authoring baby and child care. An early review of the first Common Sense book of baby and child care recognized that the book was not engraved in stone. The reviewer wrote, Spock does not pretend to state the last word because he admits that the subject of infant and child care is likely to be changed as time goes on, just as it has been in the past. He was also open to feedback. There are a few instances where the advice in baby and child care changed over time because of reader feedback. This is terrible. The first edition of Baby and Child Care included a recommendation that parents who had a baby with Down syndrome should send the baby away to live at a special home so that they don't get too attached to a child who will never develop very far. But then during the revision for the 1957 edition, a mother wrote to Spock and urged him to change it because she had a child with Down syndrome who was the joy of her life. And that edition is much more tentative about this issue, recommending that parents think about it, consult professionals, and follow their hearts and their resources. Pacifiers are another instance of how correspondence from mothers changed Spock's mind. He solicited correspondence from mothers, and reader feedback changed his recommendation about pacifiers because of compelling anecdotes by mothers who wrote to Spock saying that pacifiers didn't ruin their children.
So once again, I'm totally on the fence as to how to feel about this. Am I happy that he took advice from actual mothers raising actual babies, or do I want there to be some sort of concrete, written in stone medical research backing up these decisions? When it comes to child care and child rearing, I have to side on the side of the mothers because I am one. But this seems super in keeping with Spock's folksy image. The idea that science isn't always the be-all, end-all, but as he says in his book, or at least in later versions of his book, parents should trust themselves. Even he trusts them sometimes.
Speaking of dubious health and wellness information or disinformation, Spock reminds me of one of my most very favorite American celebrities, Oprah Winfrey, who was and is the ultimate master of reinvention. Spock, like Oprah, was self-reflective, self-deprecating sometimes, very willing to apologize, and over the course of his life, he really transformed.
How willing is Oprah to actually apologize, though? And how willing was Spock? Did he actually admit he was wrong, or did he just change the text and, think that nobody would read the earlier editions? I mean, I wish Oprah were more apologetic for some of the harmful people she's platformed over the years. Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil, I would take heartfelt apologies for both of those characters.
Good points. Good examples. Some of Spock's biggest critics changed their opinions of Spock as he changed, like Gloria Steinem, who vilified Spock in the 70s. She changed her mind about him eventually in the 80s. And get this, Ms. Magazine even listed him as a hero of the women's movement in their 10th anniversary issue.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. I think that's going a little far, Ms. Magazine. So, was Spock's needy ego responsible for his parenting advice lasting?
And his need for an income, which we'll talk about next time. We'll probably never know whether or not his public persona was meticulously crafted or if it was very sincere, but I do think that his very likable, compelling persona is a big part of why we're talking about Spock 25 years after he died. Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. Since we're talking about the ability to reinvent oneself, Spock's very own diet changed a lot from his childhood oatmeal and stewed fruit days. At one point, he got into vegetarianism, and in his old age, he was on a macrobiotic diet. Really, a lot has been written about this diet, and it's basically a Gwyneth Paltrow goop deprivation type brown rice and greens and miso broth diet. But in the original first edition of the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, Spock wrote a couple of sections on including meat in babies' diets. He wrote about canned meat soups, which sounds disgusting. He wrote about meat juice, and I don't know why he didn't just call it broth. And here's a curious recipe for scraped meat. He wrote, start with beef. Buy a piece of top round, sear it briefly on all sides in a pan without grease. This sterilizes the surface and seals in the juices. It will be raw inside. Now hold it firmly with one hand and scrape it with the grain with a strong spoon. This removes the tender red meat and leaves the tough gristle behind. Flavor with salt. Start with a teaspoonful and work up to a couple of tablespoons full as the baby gets used to it. The meat, not the salt, I think.
Okay, yeah, it's written really uncharacteristically poorly because I'm left wondering which part the baby's supposed to eat, the gristle or the tender red meat. If I think about it, I can guess, but I shouldn't have to think about it that hard.
And then what do you do with the meat that's raw inside? Does the 10th edition include any delicious sounding recipes for scraped meat?
Oh, sadly not. There is mention of delicious sounding pureed meat, but sadly no recipe is included. As with most things in the later edition, advice is far less black and white, and while meat is touted as a solid source of, quote, concentrated nutrition, parents are also warned of the dangers of E. coli and other bacteria. We can't just have good things like scraped meat anymore.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. Please subscribe so you are sure to get our next episode in which we'll explore Dr. Spock's personal finances.
See this episode's show notes for our references. If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
Special thanks to the Iowa State University Archives. We'll see you soon the next time we talk Spock.
Spock, 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 Spock.